Well, good morning. Welcome back to my portion of Studio One. Today I'm going to do several videos, so this quilt will probably still be on the rack tomorrow. We're going to start off by the way I load a top, and I float, and I have always floated. I have never done it any other way. That's the way I was taught when I bought the machine. And after watching the way it's been done on other videos, I'm glad I float, because it gets difficult. And to those that do that, probably not. But this is what I'm back to. Keep it simple. This to me is the simplest way, and it gives me the absolute most ability to adjust this quilt as I go along. On the whiteboard over on the door, I've got two words that I'll be using today frequently, probably: consistent and inconsistent. Inconsistently or consistently. Consistently is my part. I consistently have to do what I feel is the best I can do to make sure that this quilt, after I get it loaded and start putting stitches in it, remains relatively square. You remember that word. And the pattern that I'm going to put on it remains relatively level across the whole quilt. And that's where the inconsistency comes in, because Pantovision, the one that I use on my machine, on my tablet, etc., etc., is consistently inconsistent. It has been that way since day one, since Pantovision version 1, and now with Pantovision T2. It's something that has not been corrected, and I know it has been brought up. And I don't know if it's Windows, if it's the programmers, if it's the encoder wheels, whatever causes the problem. I have developed a system to consistently check and make sure that my pattern is remaining level all the way across the quilt. If I don't do that in the beginning, until I found the right tension to put on the encoders, it would move as much as 2 inches from the left to the right up. And in some cases, it moved left and right, and it had to be adjusted as I went along. Once I developed a system to make sure that the encoders on my machine are at a tension that eliminates the majority of that movement. Now when I do it, I'm adjusting a 1/16 of an inch per section, and maybe up to an 1/8 of an inch per section. But if I don't do that, and you will see as we go along when I start working on Pantovision today, you will see as I go along, if you don't do that, that pattern is going to climb up consistently. So you'll see when I lay out, how I lay out a pattern in Pantovision, and you'll see why I lay it out that way when I start doing some stitching. Right now we're just going to load a top. Again, I float. Always done it, always will. Again, I use red snappers. I don't stitch along the top. That's to me, that might be a straight line, but that doesn't mean that this border was cut straight. It doesn't mean that that's a fault, that it's not a straight border. I've used a rotary cutter, and I can understand how it can get run off. So most quilts that I do are relatively straight. The border edges or the edges of the quilt are relatively straight. If they're not, then I deal with it as I go along. What I do find to be the most accurate indicator in a quilt of being straight and level are the seams, especially when you got good points matched up, and the points are matched up really well. you can pretty much count on the quilt seams being straight. So this is all I do, is I just lay it out, and I go down to the end where the camera is usually, and I take a look down the quilt, because I want to see that it looks straight. This one's close. So what I do is I start on the left-hand side, and I measure to the first seam. And in this case, I'm going to use 8 inches to the first seam. So I got 8 on this side. I now have 8 on this side. And then I will check it in a couple of places along to make sure that it is 8 inches in this case. So I've got 8 inches all the way across now. And once again, I don't put a seam up there in the back. I don't sew the batting down to the back. I've never, to me, that's an extra step that I don't need to take, because I'm confident that this is now square to the first seam, and that first seam is relatively straight. And that looks much better. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but this is a good quilter, and she is not to the point of anal, but she's got that touch of OCD that all quilters have. And this is a really relatively well cut border, but I can see right in here where it's a little bit higher than the rest of the border. And then there's a chunk missing right here, so it's a little bit lower than the rest of the border. Is it going to show when the quilt is done? No, it's going to be bound, it's going to be covered up, and that's okay. And I come from a world where making mistakes is covered up by somebody else. When I was a framer, I had a hammer that was 24 ounces and had great big knurls on the head of the hammer, so that when I hit a nail, it went in. Well, you could mess up a wall on the studs with that hammer, but the drywaller is going to come along and cover all that up. So there's nothing wrong with that. Well, that's what it is with these borders. It's like this one here. This top border is hanging over at least 3/8 of an inch farther out than the edge. And that's okay, because it's going to be cut off. It's going to be all right. It's not going to show. But what my job is now is to make sure that that straightness stays. So when I'm quilting, I look for, here's a seam. I look to make sure that that seam stays straight. It doesn't pull, it doesn't get cockeyed. I've got this 8 inch that I measured is a seam, and I want to make sure it stays straight. And then you've got left and right. And right now, this is a little bit, I just want to tug just a little bit and get this looking straight. And visually, that's a lot of quilting, is when you're all done and it's all pieced and it's all stitched together and the sandwich is complete and somebody goes to bind it, they get it bound and then they lay it out. It looks straight. It looks right. You don't see, the only people that see the mistakes in the quilt are normally the quilter. And the only one that's going to see the mistakes in the stitching that's put in is the person that does the long arming or the machine quilting or the hand quilting. They're going to see their mistakes. I see mine just like you see yours. So that's that. Now, this is the simple part. I want to make sure that this quilt, the edges of this quilt, the left side and the right side, remain consistent with the way it starts. So in this case, I've got two measurements. I've got 45.5 on the left side And that is plus or minus, because that could vary. And I've got 105 1/4 plus or minus approximately on the right side. So we take our measurement, and for those of you that do this in your head, that's fine. I do some of it in my head, but I don't want to make a mistake. 105 1/4 minus 45 1/2 is 59 3/4 inches right here where this left and right side are. The quilt measured 61, but like I said, up here along the seam, as you recall, where I take my measurement, this top is 3/8 of an inch wider than this, and it's pretty even on this side. So it is where I took my original measurement is a little bit wider than what. So I'm off an inch, give or take. So the quilt, and that's not what's the word? It's okay. That's normal. I don't always get the exact measurement that I took up here to be the exact measurement. This happens to be 22 inches or 20 inches. 20 inches down because it varies. And I don't want to put a lot of side tension on this to stretch it out. I don't want to do that. I'm going to put some tension on it as we go along, probably. Not always. Sometimes I can do a whole quilt and not have to put any side tension on it at all. But this is the way it's loaded. And then my final step before I start my routine of thread, laying out the pattern and all that stuff, before I start that, the last thing I do is attach my magnets. I'm doing something that I'm telling you not to do. Do not handle multiple magnets at once. If you can, I've been doing it for long enough, but I've been bit twice really hard. Because if these magnets get close to each other, they will slam closed. And if your finger is in between, you're going to lose a chunk of your finger. I still don't have all my feeling back in my thumb, and it's been almost a year. So I put the magnets in. Now I'm going to put the magnets in as straight as I possibly can, and I know these magnets are straight, and they're solid steel, and they're not going to bend. I know that rod. I know the stationary bar up top, the stationary roller at the top is straight. It's not going to bend. So those are the things that I use along with this tape measure, because I know this tape measure, the way I've got it set up, is going to be the same distance from that bar on this end and this end. And it is. It's 20 3/4 of an inch to the top of that tape. I know this tape is straight. So I can use this tape to eyeball the seams. I can use these magnets to eyeball these seams, the seam, to see that it's staying as straight as it possibly can. I do not leave a gap between magnets. I make sure that my magnets are right up against each other, because a gap means that this particular part, if there was a gap here, this could be looser than where the magnets are, and the threads are going to pull on that fabric differently. I believe that to be true, because I know as I go down a quilt, often it pulls it in and it pulls it up. Not a lot, but enough that could make a seam arch. So once again, we are loaded. This looks like a little hump right here. I think that's the cut of the material, because this one's nice and straight. I think this blue was cut just a little bit differently, and you can tell that because right here there's a whole star, but to the left and right that star disappears. So it was just cut just a little off. I can pull it down a little, but it's not gonna help. So now I'm comfortable, and I will start my process. I based the sides and the top and the bottom. I do not sew the top and the sides. I based, usually 1.5 inches to a 2-inch space between needle strikes. So I will base this, and then I will come back with you in just a little bit, and we can start going through the process of how I use Pantovision T2. And I've been with Pantovision since it came out. I was fortunate enough to be on the beta testing group for T2, and it was a vast improvement over Pantovision. But Pantovision in itself is, in my words, extraordinary, flaws and all. I wish there was a way to get it figured out why that pattern has to move as I progress across the quilt. And it's interesting that the wider the quilt, the more movement there is. This quilt here, I might only have to make 1, 2, or 3 adjustments per row. I did the quilt that came off of this rack yesterday had a pattern that had 7 points of adjustment. And on almost every row, I had to make an adjustment at the end of each section of the pattern. And you will see what I mean once I get it laid out. Once again, thank you for joining me in my portion of Studio One. Have an absolutely fabulous day, and I'll get this posted as soon as I can. And along with, I'll probably post this, and there's going to be at least 2 on Pantovision. I'll probably get them all posted about the same time. If you follow us on wequilt.org, thank you very much. I haven't done a lot on the blog, but the blog is back up and running. I'm no longer posting on Facebook. It doesn't do me any good to post. They don't post what I post. So, me and Facebook aren't talking right now. I do check it once a month just to see if somebody sent me a PM. But as far as a daily check, I don't do that anymore. Facebook is off my list. I will keep my page because someday maybe somebody will buy Facebook like Elon did with Twitter. Fingers crossed. Have a wonderful day, and quilt till you wilt. We do.